Welcome to the Dr. Janine Show. Today we're talking about natural tips on how to help acne naturally. We're going to talk about what acne is, why it happens, and we'll talk about some natural solutions, how to help our acne and how to do it all naturally. So welcome into the show. Hello, Norm.
Hi, Dr. Janine. I'm really excited about that. It's bringing back some memories for me, for sure.
Is it? Yes.
But it's not just about teenagers or when you typically think acne happens. It can also be adult onset acne.
Exactly.
So we'll talk about that.
We will talk about that because it can really happen at any stage during our lives. I was blessed as a youngster not to have too much of an acne problem.
Okay.
I did at certain times in my adolescence, but then, you know, hormones change, and as I'm getting older, I can notice some surprises happening and creeping up here and there. And that's why this topic, you know, for women, I think is very interesting, and we'll shed some light on that and how the hormones are you know, part of this whole story, but to give some natural solutions as well, which is what we're all about.
We'll clear off some myths about that, certainly. And while you're watching the Dr. Janine Show, a naturopathic doctor, remember to like and subscribe and share the video. And don't forget to click that bell so you always get advance notifications of the next shows coming up, which you can check out yourself right now, previous ones, on YouTube. Follow Dr. Janine on Instagram and also on Facebook and TikTok at Dr. Janine. That's DoctorJanine. And by the way, Dr. Janine will be online to answer comments and questions during the show if you want to leave them in the comments section below. Okay, so let's get right into it and talk about the skin.
Yeah, so the skin is our largest organ, and we don't always think about that. So it's about 2 meters squared. And when we take a look at Lucy, of course, when we think of internal organs, yes, of course, the skin being our largest organ is the one that we should appreciate because it's the one that we can see. And the skin has 2 different functions. So it has a protective function as being that, you know, external protection. So it's a physical barrier. It keeps everything intact in our body. If you think about it, it's like our casing. It keeps all our organs in place. Yeah. But it has that physical protection from things and coming at us from the outside, of course. But it also has an immune barrier function. So we'll be talking a little bit about the skin microbiome and why it's so important. In our body, we actually have more microbiome, so different species of bacteria and organisms than we do our own human cells.
Really? Okay, wow.
So it's so important that we always address, and that's why we end up always talking about the microbiome in the Dr. Janine Show, because it's so important that we are finding that proper balance between good and bad organisms. So certainly when we address that today, we'll be talking about that. And the problem with acne is that there's a blockage that happens. So with our skin cells, they secrete oils from the sebaceous glands. And if that blockage of that normal process happens, then that's when we can start to see the whiteheads, the blackheads, and the pimples, and the outbreaks of the acne. And of course, we're going to talk about the different stages of this, but it is caused by inflammation first. So where in medicine, it was always deemed that inflammation was sort of the after effects of that blockage that was happening with the oil glands. Now, some research, and I have actually one of the studies that looked at this, that the current model for acne pathogenesis, is it backwards? And that was the question that the researchers were looking at. And this was in the Journal of the American Academy of Dermatology, so really an astute, you know, paper.
Sure.
That was written, and they concluded that based on the review of recent studies, we believe in opposition to the classic paradigm, which everything, you know, is all the doctors are taught in med school, that the etiological steps should be number 1 is the inflammatory response, so inflammatory dysregulation. Then secondarily was the bacteria that causes acne, and third was the formation of the comedones or the pimples. So interesting to note that they recognize, even in mainstream medicine, that inflammation and that inflammatory process. And this is, I'm sort of dangling the carrot here because I'll be talking about inflammation and why the dietary causes and eating, you know, some of the less inflammatory foods are so helpful for the acne. So we're going to get to that in just a second.
This is really interesting to me because acne is not everybody's favorite topic of discussion sometimes, because you think of pimples, you think of blackheads, acne itself is like a bad word to a lot of people, but it is fascinating to learn about. What exactly is acne, and are there different types of acne?
Yes, so when we think about the different types of acne, there's different, when we talk about the inflammatory response, there's what they said at one point was non-inflammatory, but I'd have to say probably that's not true because they've determined that all stages of acne start with the inflammation. That's one school of thought. So I think I agree with them, but that's my own personal opinion. Mm-hmm. And then of course the one's called inflammatory. So this is when, we start to see more of that inflammation response. We see the whiteheads, the blackheads, and certainly the redness happening with the inflammation.
It can hurt too.
Of course, with the clogged cells and those when it gets into the cystic stage, so the very inflamed and large red pimples, which can be very painful, absolutely. So those would be the different types of acne, and then this happens in different grades. So it's actually been broken down. So grade 1 would be the whiteheads, the blackheads, and the blackheads are called open comedones, and the whiteheads are called the closed comedones, and that's because whether there's melanin. So when they're called blackheads because the melanin has been oxidized. So melanin is what gives our skin our nice suntan when it's exposed to UV radiation, and that has been oxidized, and that's why it turns black. So it's either black or white when it hasn't been oxidized, and that's how they break down sort of the first grade of acne. Second grade would be moderate breakout, so this is happening once in a while. Third grade would be more inflammatory, so we definitely see the red inflamed, and it's happening more often. And the fourth stage, which is the worst, is when we have the nodules and the cysts, and they can be hard and very painful. And this is, it's so disheartening to see, especially youngsters, the teenagers that go through this, and we're going to talk about some of their struggles, not just on the physical level, but on the mental, emotional level as well.
So different grades of acne.
Yes.
That's fascinating to me. And you talked about teenagers, which I know is not the focus of the whole show, but it is an element of it.
Yeah.
They've got other things going on, like hormones and everything else at the same time, right?
Exactly.
So yes, and I know I'm wearing some facial hair today, and which made me think that some people probably grow a little bit of facial hair to cover it sometimes. I don't even know if that's a good idea. Anyway, we'll talk about that. So we know this affects different people at different stages of life. Can you expand upon that a bit?
Yes, so we know that the teenagers, certainly when they're growing and then their hormones kick in, so usually this has to do a lot with the androgens, so testosterone increases that oil production and the pore size, and this is where some of that bacteria that's known to be causing some of that inflammation and the acne, this becomes a problem. So that would be certainly when we know most people who have suffered with a lot of acne, and happens in the teen stages with the hormonal changes, but certainly in adults as well. So in men and women, this is when the hormones change later in life as adults. This can be one of those problems as well.
Equally, so, men to women?
I would say, in my experience, and certainly in my clinical practice with seeing patients, I think I saw more women who had the hormonal concerns, at different stages, whether it was through pregnancy or in perimenopause or the menopausal acne that can happen just because everything's out of whack. And certainly you need not have that as a woman if you're suffering with hormones being out of balance. That's not necessarily the way it's supposed to be, but it's so common because of our environmental stresses and toxins that we're exposed to. Some of the things that we'll talk about when we're talking about the solutions and the natural solutions to helping with the acne. So there's something now which is very new called maskne.
Maskne, that sounds interesting.
Right, so certainly when everybody's wearing the facial masks now, which, I never wore a mask as a kid. No. I'm not, in the operating theater and doing operations.
Even as a doctor, you never had a...
No, we didn't. Yeah, so this is something that is definitely newer, and it's a thing now, and people that didn't normally get acne because of closing off their skin to the oxygen and having to wear the mask for usually for prolonged periods of time. This is a thing. So, all the tips that we're sharing today will help with that as well.
That is really interesting. You're right, with what has happened during the pandemic, people are wearing masks for prolonged periods of time for work,
yes,
or for school, which is being discussed also, and all sorts of things.